Burkina Faso just made a bold move, declaring all land as state-owned and permanently banning foreign ownership. But that's not what shook the world. It's what President Traoré plans to do with this land next that no one saw coming. What's the real agenda behind this game-changing decision? Let's dive in. It wasn't a demonstration. It wasn't a coup. Not even television broadcast it. Burkina Faso, however, did what entire continents have been avoiding for decades with a single stroke of the pen. It took back the earth under its own feet. Not with catchphrases or diplomats, but with legislation. Ownership itself was redefined by a strict, unchangeable law. The new policy's radicalism stems from its honesty rather than its aggression. It acknowledges what no one in world politics wants to publicly express. In its current state, that African land has turned into money. For people who don't live on it, a tool. To make money, work it, or comprehend it. Thus, the charade was put an end to by Traoré's government. The Burkina-based state owns all of the land in the reform states, whether it be rural or urban. Not to old colonial families, not to landlords, and most definitely not to foreign entrepreneurs hoping to construct golf resorts on holy ground. The public now have the ability to access the title, which is held by the government. Through national belonging, not through purchase. Privatization is not what this is. This is a respite from it. Practically speaking, foreigners are no longer able to purchase land, never will be. Of course, they can apply for leases. If short-term, 18 years. If strategic, 99 years. But the actual ground? Untouchable. What's even more innovative about it is this. Not all Burkinabe residents are the preferred purchasers. They are the sole purchasers. This isn't limited to international businesses. It's also about addressing the covert inequality that exists within the country's boundaries. When peasant farmers scream for a blanket-sized area, while the wealthy elites keep thousands of hectares. Every citizen now has an equal right to opportunities rather than ownership. And the key is opportunity. Land reform has been about doing circles, passing documents, holding conferences, and making declarations that no one implements for far too long. Burkina Faso has eliminated the intermediary. Instead of being the auctioneer, the state takes on the role of curator. Because land invariably ends up in the hands of the wealthiest people rather than those in most need when it is handled like a product. And all around the continent, that is precisely what has occurred. Huge plots are sold to foreign companies for peanuts, and residents are forced to leave their villages for development that they never requested. The new law lays out how state agencies may purchase land in the public interest for a variety of purposes and repeals the 1975 Apartheid-era Expropriation Act. That pipeline is closed by this law. Chile. Consider yourself a multinational corporation interested in acquiring land in West Africa. You're wealthy. You have power. However, you are informed that you will never be the owner of this land, regardless of what you offer. Never. Not only is that inconvenient, it is a paradigm shift. It is referred to as hostile in the corporate sector. Burkina Faso, however, refers to it as healing, going back to something more sacred than contracts. African soil became a global commodity due to the ties that existed between people and their land even before colonization. And don't assume that this is simply about farmland. It has to do with urban growth. Areas used for mining, corridors of energy, woods, rivers, holy places, everything. Because land is more than just a resource under this new rule. It's a trust. And for far too long, that confidence has been betrayed. Critics have already sharpened their blades, of course. Some people refer to it as irresponsible, a measure that will deter investment. It is deemed unconstitutional by others, as if there is any moral superiority to constitutions drafted under colonial constraint. Traoré, however, does not recoil, because he is aware that capital flight is not the true issue. It's the possibility that people will stay, remain on their farms. remain in their localities. Remain rooted in the land without worrying about it being stolen, flipped, or sold away. And they build after they remain. That is this reform's subtle genius. It's not against progress. It is merely a development that is anti-predatory. Traoré is forcing a fresh dialogue by removing land from the market. One in which local needs must be met by investment, not the other way around. Furthermore, this goes beyond simple politics. It is a calculated move. When all land is owned by the state, national planning makes sense. Private estates don't have to be surrounded by infrastructure. Absentee landlords do not impede projects. Redrawing the map to benefit people rather than corporations is possible. However, this is just the start. Because it's one thing to change the law. Generations of poverty, mismanagement, and exploitation changing. That is a completely other war. They have recovered the land. It needs to be renewed today, though. Re-established contact with the people that were kicked off it. Given to people who have never handled it. And transformed for people who have only ever thought about it as a means of survival. Never as authority. The documents are signed. The statements made. They've written the headlines. However, people are not liberated by land alone. Because unsupported land is simply a battle on a larger scale. Therefore, the more difficult process starts now that Burkina Faso has established its boundaries, asserted its sovereignty, and claimed its territory. Granting the land to those who can use it for construction, sustenance, growth, and survival. The government of Traoré is aware of this. This has nothing to do with headlines. It has to do with crops. For the sake of symbolic success, the state is not merely securing land. It's using strategy to open it up. Land reclamation is just the first step. Phase 2 is redistributing it purposefully. And this time, the forgotten majority gets first dibs instead of the elite. The first person in line, small-scale farmers. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Despite never owning the land, men and women have been cultivating it for generations. Renting from international companies or absentee landlords that viewed food as a profit margin. These households are now receiving plots from the state. As a restoration, not a gift. Partnerships as well as plots. Access to climate-resilient farming, irrigation, crop rotation, collective water systems, and state-run agricultural programs. Because land is merely dirt if you don't have the proper tools. The second wave, cooperatives for women. Women perform the majority of agricultural work in most African countries, but they frequently possess nothing. By giving women's organizations direct access to land for farming, raising cattle, and even agro-processing, Traoré's policy reverses that disparity. It's an economic design as well as empowerment. Whole communities stabilize when women own the land. Education rates climb, income diversifies, and food security increases. That is a fact, not a theory. The young people follow. Half of Burkina Faso's population is under the age of 17. This youth bulge has been viewed as a crisis for many years. Too few jobs, too many mouths. However, what if it's a benefit? That's what the government believes. State-leased acreage linked to national employment programs is being made available to young people for agro-entrepreneurship as well as farming. This includes companies that use technology for solar drying, vertical farming, seed research, irrigation, and storage. Burkina Faso transforms rural migration into rural innovation in this way. Young people can now return to the land with honor and financial gain, rather than swarming into cities in search of unfulfilling employment. Is the genius, though? Burkina Faso continues to attract foreign investors. Businesses must now apply for long-term leases through state channels if they wish to construct factories or raise crops. Additionally, their projects must be in line with national priorities rather than a fixation with exports. No more seizing thousands of acres to cultivate avocado exports for overseas markets or European flowers. Food sovereignty is currently the main topic. Burkina Faso should be fed first. Crops for self-reliance, stability, and nutrition are replacing crops that were originally planted for financial gain. Africa is no longer feeding the globe at its own expense, which is a strategic shift that few in the West want to recognize. There are other aspects of that reorientation than agriculture. It is industrial, because it's not simply about who grows what when it comes to land reform. Additionally, it concerns the locations of processing, packaging, and sales. The new economic vision will give preference to regional partners and Burkina Faso-owned companies over international monopolies when allocating land for industrial zones. Instead of importing tomato paste from Italy, local firms will produce it. Local grain mills as opposed to supply chains in China. The plan is full circle. Process locally, grow locally, and eat locally. This isn't isolationism, though. Economic discipline is what it is. The nation is not shutting down. All you have to do is choose who passes through them, when, and why. And something very straightforward is maybe one of this new land system's most underappreciated triumphs. Clarity. Disputes decrease when land is controlled, records are national, and ownership is off the market. Legal ambiguity vanishes. Boundary disputes, title disputes, and inheritance disputes all start to wane. Farmers, builders, and business owners will have greater confidence as a result of fewer court proceedings, evictions, and bribes. Because you can't build houses, breed livestock, or grow food on land you're afraid you could lose tomorrow. Burkina Faso is placing a wager that soil security will translate into life security. There are still challenges, of course. The infrastructure is inadequate. There is a real climate shift. Corruption won't go away on its own. However, the principles are being reset for the first time in decades. Because land is neither a luxury nor a favor under this system, it's accurate. An obligation. A start. The rest of the continent is now observing Burkina Faso's initial audacious moves. Leaders from Harare to Algiers, from Nairobi to Lagos, are posing the same silent query. Is this the model? Would land eventually belong to its inhabitants rather than foreign speculators? What occurs when a movement like this gains traction, if any? You're overlooking the wider picture if you believe Burkina Faso is behaving alone. Because this new land law wasn't created overnight. It didn't appear suddenly or fall out of the sky. It sprung from a continent that was already tense, awakening, and rising. At the heart of that awakening too, South Africa. Land reform returned to South African politics in 2024 with a vengeance that the world had not witnessed since the end of apartheid. It wasn't just internal this time either. It turned into a world war. By questioning century-old property rules and daring to prioritize black land reclamation, President Ramaphosa's administration redoubled its efforts to expropriate land without providing compensation. The white landowners resisted. Investors from the West panicked. Then Donald Trump arrived. Trump shocked African officials by threatening to stop US funding to South Africa if the country proceeded to seize lands held by white people. He accused South Africa of racism and referred to it as a land grab. He even attempted to make land reform into a transatlantic conflict by entangling Elon Musk. South Africa, however, did not flinch. In 2025, it increased its efforts, issued additional motions, enlarged the land court, and started pilot programs including expropriation without compensation. Was it disorganized? Indeed. Was it flawless? No. However, it was courageous. It also set off a fuse, because leaders in other parts of Africa witnessed something they hadn't seen in decades. A government that refused to apologize for regaining its territory and stood up to the West. Burkina Faso was also observing. Traoré's decision to nationalize all land in early 2025 wasn't just a daring change of course. It was a clear extension of the work that South Africa had initiated. This time, however, there was no constitutional dispute, no parliamentary impasse, and no American ambassador obstructing investment agreements. Only a law, just one law. Overnight, the ground beneath millions of people underwent a transformation. Burkina Faso isn't taking any new action. It's working more quickly. Burkina Faso took to the streets, while South Africa battled in the courts. Traore responded with policy, while Ramaphosa used diplomacy to counter Trump's threats. Burkina Faso also accelerated where South Africa paused. But competitiveness isn't the point here. This relay is continental in nature, an exchange between the underdogs and the mighty, between burgeoning nationalist republics and established democracies. Because both nations are currently engaged in the same war, in spite of their differences. The struggle to restore African land to its original state. Furthermore, the debate is no longer South African. It's evolving into an African philosophy. Conversations from Namibia to Kenya are evolving. In student forums, young leaders are bringing up Burkina Faso. In court applications, activists are citing South Africa's refusal. Farmers without land are posing a fresh query. Why can't we do it if they can? Naturally, the conflict appears differently in every nation. International pressure, robust institutions, and historical wealth are all challenges facing South Africa. After years of instability, economic isolation, and military transformation, Burkina Faso is now on the mend. However, there is now a shared ideology. It is not a commodity, that land. Sovereignty must be the purpose of that possession. That pressure from outside doesn't mean we should quit. It's an excuse to accelerate. And for that reason, now is important. Burkina Faso is currently facing the same issues that South Africa did in 2024. International censure, investment anxiety, and Trump's threats. The president, the empire, the language, and the tone are all different. Nevertheless, opposition is increasing. A continental strategy is emerging from what started as an internal policy of one nation. Additionally, if it spreads, Africa's post-colonial economy's foundations might suddenly collapse and reconstruct. Therefore, this revolution was not created in Burkina Faso. However, it improved, expedited, and localized it. And the question of whether land reform will determine Africa's future is no longer relevant now that the torch has been transferred and the fire is growing. How far will it go, though? Will the continents unite, or will silence, sanctions, and threats tear them apart one by one? The air changes as an African country regains sovereignty over its territory. It's almost audible. The unease in London's boardrooms, the fear in Brussels, and the threats that were muttered over diplomatic cables from Washington to Nairobi. The motive is as old as the embassy wall's flag. Someone in the West always says that Africans' claims to their land are a threat to stability. Here's what has changed, though. Nobody is paying attention anymore. Burkina Faso failed to receive praise after passing its land reform law. Because it wished to incite penalties, it refrained from nationalizing its territory. The old model was irreparably damaged, so it did it. African nations were instructed for decades to play the game, remain receptive to global investment, heed the advice of the IMF, sell their raw minerals, lease their property to foreign partners, and receive pats on the head and dribbles of aid in exchange. However, it only served to make African land a commodity that was exchanged between businesses, pushing the local population to the periphery. Ibrahim Traoré was doing more than simply altering the legal wording when he signed the land decree into law. He was permanently reversing that trend. Naturally, the response was prompt. The media in the West referred to it as reckless. It was deemed harmful by think tanks. Burkina Faso would soon be economically isolated, some whispered. Contracts for development were put on hold. Embassy representatives started to allude to potential repercussions. But because he is not alone, Traoré didn't give up. He is not, and will not be the last African leader to face threats for not selling out his people. The situation in South Africa was similar. The outcry was swift and severe after it revived its drive to expropriate land without compensation in an attempt to fully reverse the legacy of apartheid that left millions of black South Africans without land. Burkina Faso is currently fighting that same fire, but with greater urgency and fewer resources. It's not that one nation reclaims its territory that the West is most afraid of. It is afraid that others will do the same. In order to elude French monetary oversight, Mali and Niger have already joined Burkina Faso in their quest for collective economic independence and established a confederal bank. Long chastised for its land reclamation policies, Zimbabwe is now being re-examined, not as a warning story, but as a precursor to the future course of the conflict. More leaders throughout the continent are coming to the conclusion that sanctions are not the end of the story. In the price of sovereignty, they are but another chapter. The purpose of sanctions is to destroy African economies. They reveal the terror of the West today. Burkina Faso started financing its own rice production and re-industrializing its supply lines when it was cut off from help. The nation's regional links were reinforced when the West halted diplomatic relations, and the leadership grinned when multinationals threatened to withdraw since the land would stay, and now it was rightfully Burkinabe's. There is no doubt that the path ahead will be difficult. There will be pressure, secret efforts, and economic sabotage masquerading as market reactions. Foreign influence doesn't go away lightly. Leaders in Africa, however, are becoming aware of these strategies. People are also observing. They recall the appearance of their governments caving into pressure from outside sources. They recall what it was like when villages were abruptly uprooted and their land was sold off for mining contracts and sugar plantations. They are the movement this time, not only observers. The West has the authority to remove envoys, impose sanctions, and halt trade. However, the risk has been considered by this generation of African leaders. Isolation from Europe is not the true threat. The true threat is alienation from your people. And they realize that they are creating something more powerful than coalitions from Ouagadougou to Pretoria. They are establishing credibility. The message is clear. Africa's time of silent submission is done. You can demonize, disrupt, and impose sanctions on us, but you can't stop us now. There is no more time to hesitate. The continent is rising with commitment rather than fury. Do you think they can scare Traoré? Will nations in Africa be prevented from claiming their own land? What will happen if other African countries join Burkina Faso? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more informative videos about Africa's sovereignty, Black history, and global power dynamics.